here. Tonight we're going to talk about the COVID Olympics that are about to happen in Beijing again next month, and we're about 2 weeks out, so it's about time to just give a quick update on the way things are playing out over in Beijing. So I'll just kind of do a quick rundown of a bunch of things that have come up, and one of the really funny, or not really funny, but just expected and amazing how it's just happening like you totally expect, but there's all sorts of security problems with apps and phones and all sorts of devices and services that people have to use during the Beijing Olympics. Everyone is very concerned about privacy, data, monitoring, all that kind of stuff because, of course, during the pandemic, Beijing is going to monitor everyone. It's going to use things you have to download for X reason to monitor you for Y reason. That is pretty standard, pretty obvious, but it's causing a little minor kerfuffle out there, and it's just another sign of what people should expect, especially with all the COVID craziness going on in China. There's almost nothing else you can expect. The very fact this Olympics are even going on is odd, to say the least, but again, kind of expected with what Beijing is up to. It needs to show that it is totally handling things and isn't going to be undermined in any of its grand events and initiatives by a pandemic. So COVID is still raging in China, right? It's been reported in every major city. Omicron has been reported in every major Chinese city, and it's really, spreading like wildfire, although it is being moderately controlled, somewhat controlled. We'll see how well they do. But one thing that's definitely come out recently is how the COVID numbers from the beginning in China were definitely fake, and it's becoming clear that the numbers you're seeing now are also almost certainly fake. And I have a podcast episode from, May, June of 2020 or something. It's called, what was it called? It was called Beyond the Quarantine. It was the second episode in the whole China Revel podcast series. Everybody should check out. Just listen to this video. And I said, back then I was like, these numbers are totally fake. They're there to, the initial COVID deaths were there to make the government seem really competent, and they were there to limit the number of apparent deaths when it was definitely much higher. Although obviously they did get a handle on it. The actual numbers that people were getting were totally fake, and there were people who were dying, and they're on their death certificate they were being declared dead from very different causes than COVID. But that's the way it happened. And as China's been doing this entire time during the crisis, it is once more pointing fingers abroad, and it's almost kind of funny, right? I mean, China is just like, the pandemic started in China, and there's this weird propaganda reverse psychology it's trying to do to somehow make it seem like the pandemic is really existing and spawning outside of China. Back in, again, 2020, early on, it was declaring that this might have started in Italy and all sorts of other places, and it's kind of a crazy thing to hear, but that was definitely a huge part of it. At different stages of the pandemic, the propaganda sort of ebbed and flowed with the tides, and it was trying to make whatever inroads it could in the Chinese population to convince them that this was not primarily the Communist Party's fault, that the Communist Party was doing extremely well, that the rest of the world was doing very poorly, and that this is another example of how much better and more competent the Communist Party is than basically any other government in the world. And so part of that, what you get is China blames all sorts of outbreaks on foreign packages and frozen food, other goods, mail, all this kind of stuff. And on like a deeper level, it's basically trying to show that the rest of the world is unclean, and China is the sort of pure, uncontaminated place on Earth, and it's worth protecting and doing whatever needs to be done to get that to be permanent, right? And to not have any sort of infiltrations of disease and all that into China. That is a really sort of deeper psychological thing going on. It's very effective, but there's just a limit to how much people are actually going to put up with this. Like, how long are people actually going to keep going through multiple rounds of insane lockdowns in their cities, and then the insane numbers of testing and the pretty involuntary sorts of quarantines and stuff going on. It's something that even the Chinese population, which is pretty willing to go along with a lot of these things, and the sort of event of it supporting China's pursuit of national greatness and autonomy and all that sort of stuff, even China and the Chinese people are starting to wear thin with all this when the entire rest of the world has really shifted from the zero COVID policy, but Beijing still isn't going to do it. So we'll see how long that lasts. As I said in multiple videos, but Beijing's still sticking with it, and they really are probably almost certainly going to do it through the Olympics, because that would just be too big of a blow. The face would not be able to recover. They would lose way too much face for that to actually happen. And what's one of the more hilarious and kind of absurd things going on is that Beijing is actually declaring that other countries don't value human life. So they're saying that one of the great reasons that the CCP is implementing this zero COVID policy is because it values human life more than these other horrific countries that would rather just sacrifice their populations for the sake of some semblance of normality, right? And that is just insane, right? This is the crazy levels of propaganda you get in China when you're at this stage of where we basically are in their cycle. And it's kind of remarkable, right? I mean, this is the party that implemented the one-child policy, that has done pretty heinous, brutal things in the environmental sphere, the labor sphere, ethnic relations, just name it, pretty much name it, even during war. I mean, they had like what they did in the Korean War for their own people. It's not the regime that should be saying this, right? You take the entire length of the Communist Party's history, the Chinese Communist Party, and it's one of the more brutal regimes around just because of what it's had to do. And if you want to make a bet on what they're going to have to do to try and keep things together in the coming years, might even be worse than what they've done so far. Kind of spooky, but that is not impossible, to say the least. And so you got that going on, but what is even more amusing in this entire process is the fact that the Chinese people aren't even going to be able to go to the Olympics, right? The Chinese public is no longer allowed to buy tickets because this is that same problem. You're trying to have an Olympics where foreigners come in, but the foreigners might be contaminated, and they might bring COVID in, so you can't actually have your people see it, but you want to have your people see it because you're trying to show how great you are and what a show you put on and how great your athletes are and how great the state is and how much better it is than everybody else. So it's kind of a tough thing to do. It's going to be a totally closed show, at least as far as the Chinese population is concerned, which is pretty amusing, but kind of makes sense when you kind of get these just very conflicted positions when you're Beijing, when you want all sorts of things that you can't have, you need all sorts of things that you want, but don't want to actually make happen the way they would need to happen. You kind of end up with this sort of stuff. And of course, no one can complain, right? If you complain, you get jailed, you get censored. If you're an athlete and do that, it's even worse. Your career is pretty much over. You're bunted to somewhere in the back of the Chinese interior where no one will find you. And that's the way it goes. It's the same for foreign countries as well, who are trying to stick it to China in various ways. I have a video about how the Olympics is being used by the United States in particular, to sort of line people up against China, for China, or against China. And everything China is doing with the zero COVID policies and everything it's doing is basically highlighting a lot of the differences between it and the West. And it kind of makes it easier for the U.S. and other countries to, line up the teams, so to speak, in this conflict. And it's a tough one for China to really deal with, right? You can't really do much about the fact that you have all these super contradictory policies and events and goals all commingling in a way that just can't be untied, right? It's a bit of a Gordian knot here. You can't just make it work because you want it to work. You can't just have all these things happen because you're going to make them happen by sheer force of will. That is how you build buildings and try and get bridges and skyscrapers and train lines and all sorts of things up. You just force it through sheer force of will. But other things, you can't really do it the same way. And then, just a couple other final things. We have the return of anal swab testing in China. So people who don't know, this was something that was used on foreigners, notoriously on foreigners and foreign diplomats a little while ago during the pandemic, earlier on in the pandemic, and it caused a bit of a global outcry because what are you doing? Basically, you can do foreigners or anybody, but basically it's the party thinks it is more accurate. It probably is more accurate for whatever reason, right? It gets the heat, whatever part of the colon is actually makes it better for the swabs. It's actually quite possible, but who cares when you're the Communist Party, right? Who cares about dignity, right? Let's just do it to be more accurate, even if it requires people to just throw down their pants and let a random official twist a swab up their butt. Doesn't really matter. This is China. We have to get the most efficient and accurate result. And so who knows how actually accurate that is accurate. This is one of those things where all sorts of reports and media stuff is coming out around the Olympics. A lot of this stuff is meant to just totally smear China in various ways and to incense people, which is fine, right? That's what people are doing. That gets a lot of clicks. That's really cool. But again, if you're trying to have this be a somewhat successful event, you're probably not going to have just notoriously unpleasant and unnecessary procedures going on right around there. So maybe they're doing it a little before, but it's really unlikely they'll be doing it at a mass scale during the Olympics. That would just be a great way to shine a terrible, terrible light on China, right? And this is, again, the sort of funny place we're at, where the 2008, you had this big show where Beijing was actually cleaning up Beijing before the 2008 Olympics. Like, what they did was actually improve all sorts of bathroom facilities. They made people change their behavior. There was less spitting. There was less all sorts of things that Westerners would consider unsanitary, unhygienic. This was all they tried to stamp all this out, at least around the Olympics, right? They wanted to make it as nice as possible. They wanted to put in as good a show as possible. They wanted to have their best angles, the best face possible for the picture that the world was taking. And that's kind of what they've been also somewhat trying to do in the Olympics of 2022. But like I said, it's just a giant mess, and they can't get anything right. So instead of that, sort of, oh wow, look, they've prettied everything up. They built all these new facilities. You hear that the ski facilities that they're going to use are basically empty of snow, and the party's going to have to kind of seed the sky to get the snow to come down. It sounds crazy. It sounds like science fiction, but that's actually what they're going to do. People were complaining or making an interesting observation that Beijing doesn't quite get enough snow to really be a place to have the Winter Olympics. It's not exactly Vancouver. It's not Salt Lake City. It's not Sochi. Like, this is not a place that gets enough snow for this in general. And it also had a particularly dry year, so that you have hilarious pictures you can find on the internet of just basically barren slopes with very little snow. So they're gonna have to make the snow happen. So you hear about that. And then finally, just as the last thing, China's actually banning flights from the U.S. to China because they're, again, worried about COVID. And this is like the hilarious thing you see, where you're trying to get people to come to the country, right? And instead, you're having people getting banned. You're getting the U.S. banned, but you're also kind of allowing diplomats. Like, China is trying to balance out the whole boycott by allowing the U.S. diplomats to come if they want, and saying, oh, we're so open, we're so this, we're so that. Meanwhile, they're banning the flights, and now the U.S. is retaliating by banning Chinese flights. And this is actually the precise opposite of what China wants, right? You could say this is kind of similar to Japan just last year, right, when it was doing the last Olympics that got pushed back. But it was kind of different. It was not so conflicted and kind of tormented, really, in the way you see with these Chinese Olympics. And I'm kind of doing these videos on them every so often just because it is such a great keystone moment. You actually don't know how memorable a moment like this will be until afterwards, right? So people it wasn't until the Beijing Olympics were really happening in 2008, the Summer Olympics, that people were like, wow, this was a big event. It really felt like China was getting into the world and walking onto the world stage in a major way. And we actually don't know. But I think it's actually really quite possible that by 2022, these Olympics will be seen going forward or looking back as a major low point for Beijing, just because of the sheer number of terrible kind of events and things going on all around it. And they're kind of conspiring to undermine the whole thing. So there's the quick update. I ran down a whole list of things that are kind of vaguely hilarious, ridiculous, kind of fun that Beijing is doing near and around the 2022 Olympics. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like it, subscribe, put on notifications. You can get more videos. It'll be awesome. There's cool stuff coming. And with that, I will see you next time.